welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Forgotten Hotel. It was a crisp autumn evening when I found myself driving along the winding road toward the old hotel. I had just finished my last job in the city, and I had received a call from a former colleague offering me a quick freelance gig at a historical hotel for the night. The pay was good, and I wasn't one to turn down work. I had heard rumors about the hotel over the years, most of which were hushed whispers, but curiosity always gets the best of me. I didn't believe in ghosts or strange occurrences, so I figured it would just be a quiet, uneventful job. The old hotel, called the Edenbrook Inn, sat on the edge of a small town in the middle of nowhere, nestled at the foot of a large hill. The hotel was over a century old, one of those Victorian-style buildings with intricate woodwork, grand staircases, and old, faded wallpaper. It looked like it had once been the height of luxury, but time had not been kind. The once elegant exterior had faded, the paint peeling and the windows boarded up, giving it an abandoned feel. Despite the hotel's condition, it was still in operation, though barely. The place was mostly empty during the off-season, but the owner, Mr. Daniels, a man in his mid-60s, was an eccentric character who seemed to be holding onto the place as if it were the last thing he had left in the world. I arrived just after sunset, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the hotel's broken-down facade. The air felt heavy with the kind of stillness you only find in places long forgotten by time. When I entered the lobby, the air smelled faintly of mildew and dust. The floors creaked under my feet as I walked in, the silence around me punctuated only by the sound of the old grandfather clock ticking away in the corner. The front desk, which should have been manned, was empty, but the bell was sitting there, just waiting for someone to ring it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the hollow space. No response. I rang the bell. Moments later, a man appeared from behind a door that I hadn't noticed before, the door leading to a dim hallway filled with shadows. Mr. Daniels was a tall man with a thick gray beard, wearing an old-fashioned suit. His eyes were tired but sharp, and he gave me a quick, almost nervous smile. "Ah, you must be here for the overnight shift," he said in a voice that sounded as though it had been through many years of use. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I assume you know what to do." I nodded, slightly confused. "Yes, I've worked in similar places before." "What exactly do you need me to do?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The place has been quiet for months. But there's one thing you should know. This hotel has a history, one that not many people speak of. I need you to check the rooms, especially on the upper floors, and make sure everything is in order. The guests, they're particular. We don't want to disturb them." Before I could ask more questions, he turned and gestured for me to follow him. "I'll show you where to start. The upper floors need more attention tonight. The elevators don't work properly, so you'll have to take the stairs. Just keep your wits about you." As he led me up the stairs to the first floor, I couldn't help but notice how strange the building felt. It was as if the air itself had a weight to it, and the silence was unsettling. Each step I took seemed to reverberate louder than it should have, and the flickering lights above me made everything seem a bit more surreal. Mr. Daniels stopped in front of a door near the end of the hallway. "This is the room you'll be checking first," he said, handing me a large brass key. "Room 307, it's been in used for a while, but there are always rumors about it. If you find anything odd, come straight back down and don't try to fix it yourself. I took the key and opened the door to room 307. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt colder. The room was dark, with only a faint moonlight seeping through the curtains. The bed, draped in dusty sheets, stood in the center of the room, and the furniture around it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, as if time had simply stopped in this place. I went about my work, checking the linens and making sure the furniture was in its proper place, but something felt off. There was an old portrait on the wall, a painting of a woman in a long, flowing dress. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. I shivered involuntarily. As I was about to leave the room, I heard a noise. It was faint, but distinct, a soft rustling, like the sound of someone moving in the next room. I paused, listening. It was followed by a low whisper, a voice I couldn't quite make out. I stepped back toward the door and turned the handle, only to find that it wouldn't budge. The door had been locked from the outside. "Hello?" I called out, but the voice was gone. Panic began to creep up my spine as I pulled on the door handle, but it was no use. I looked around the room, trying to find another exit. That's when I noticed it, the painting of the woman was gone. I turned around quickly, scanning the room. The woman had moved. She was now standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall, her long hair cascading down her back. Her eyes were no longer cold and lifeless in the painting but seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with tension as I tried again to open the door. This time, it gave way. I stumbled out into the hallway, breathing heavily. I raced back down the stairs, my mind spinning. What had I just seen? Was it some sort of prank? Or was there something more sinister at work in this hotel? When I reached the lobby, Mr. Daniels was waiting by the front desk. His eyes were narrowed, and his expression was grave. "Did you check room 307? He asked quietly. I nodded, still shaken. "Yes, but there's something wrong with that room. It's not right." I heard a voice, and the painting was. He sighed deeply, as though he had been expecting this. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "There's something you need to know. Room 307, it's been closed for years for a reason. That woman in the painting, she was the last guest to stay here. The rumors say she died in that room, but no one really knows the truth. Ever since then, strange things have been happening. The staff, they've all left one by one. I'm the only one left who remembers." I looked at him, confused. "But why is the room still open? Why didn't you tell me?" Mr. Daniels looked away. "You needed to know for yourself. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run far away from that hotel. Something in the back of my mind urged me to stay. I had to know more. I had to uncover the truth." But when I turned to speak again, Mr. Daniels was gone. The hotel was empty. Story: The Night Shift at Luna's Diner. It was a crisp autumn evening in the small town of Willow Creek, a sleepy little place where everyone knew each other's names and nothing much ever happened. The streets were quiet. The trees swayed lazily in the cool breeze, and the full moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft, eerie glow over everything. In the heart of this town stood Luna's Diner, a 24-hour establishment known for its greasy burgers, fresh coffee, and an old-school charm that never seemed to fade. The diner had been there longer than most of the town's residents, its red neon sign flickering at night like a beacon of warmth and comfort. I worked the night shift at Luna's, a job I'd taken on to make some extra cash before heading off to college. I was 18, newly graduated from high school, and eager to escape the confines of my small town. But until then, the diner would be my home away from home, or so I thought. It was my third week working alone on the late shift when it all started. Most nights were uneventful. I would sweep the floors, wipe down the counters, and occasionally serve a late night trucker or two. The rest of the time, I kept myself busy by reading or watching the occasional old movie on the black and white TV that hung in the corner of the diner. But this night felt different from the start. It was around 1:30 a.m., and the diner was dead quiet. Not a soul in sight. The occasional hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of the jukebox in the corner were the only things that broke the silence. I was cleaning the tables when I heard it, something faint but unmistakable. The soft sound of a woman laughing, almost like it was coming from the back of the diner. I froze, my mop hovering in midair. The laugh sounded distant but so real that I couldn't ignore it. I looked around, expecting to see someone, maybe a late-night customer who had slipped in unnoticed. But the place was empty. No one at the counter, no one in the booths. I walked toward the back, passing the kitchen and the storage room, where the sound seemed to have originated. Nothing. The back was as silent as the rest of the diner. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my imagination or the odd acoustics of the old building. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the clock ticked on, I continued my routine, cleaning the tables, wiping down the counters, and trying to forget about the strange sound. But it wasn't long before I heard it again. The same soft laugh, followed by a quick gasp. This time, it came from the storage room. I stood still for a moment, heart pounding in my chest. Was someone in there? I grabbed the nearest broom and cautiously made my way toward the door that led to the back. The moment I stepped inside the storage room, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The shelves, which were usually neatly organized, were now in disarray. Boxes had been knocked over, and there was a faint smell in the air, like something had been burnt. But the strangest thing was the light. The fluorescent bulb above me flickered, casting shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I hesitated but then called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no answer, just a strange, unsettling silence. I took a step further into the room, my heart racing as I looked around. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. I whipped around, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I just stood there, trying to process what had happened. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something was definitely wrong. I rushed to the door, fumbled with the handle, and yanked it open. When I stepped out of the storage room, I was relieved to find myself back in the main part of the diner. But even though I had escaped the strange feeling of being trapped in the back room, the eerie sensation didn't go away. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything, not with the unsettling feeling gnawing at the pit of my stomach. The laughter kept coming back in short bursts, always faint and distant, as if someone were trying to get my attention. I was sure I was alone in the diner, but the sounds, those strange, disembodied laughs, made me question everything. Around 3 a.m., something even stranger happened. The jukebox, which had been off all night, suddenly came to life. The soft strains of an old 1950s rock and roll song filled the air, though no one had touched it. I froze, staring at the jukebox as the lights on its side began to flicker. The song was one I'd heard 100 times before, Jailhouse Rock, the same tune that played whenever the jukebox was left to its own devices. But this time, the music sounded different. It wasn't just the sound. There was something off about the way it filled the space, like it was distorted, warping in and out. I walked over to the jukebox, my hand hovering near the switch, but before I could touch it, the music stopped abruptly. Then, the door to the women's restroom, one of the two restrooms in the diner, creaked open. I looked at it, confused. No one had come in or out of the restroom all night. Slowly, I walked over, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I opened the door, I was met with an empty restroom, but there was something strange about the mirror above the sink. It wasn't the normal reflection I was used to seeing. Instead of my own face, I saw the faint outline of a woman standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I closed the door quickly and turned to look around the diner. The whole place seemed to be closing in on me. The walls felt like they were breathing, and the air grew thick and heavy. It was as if the diner itself had become something else, something alive, something aware of me. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 4 a.m. Just one more hour until my shift ended. I could make it. I had to make it. But as the minutes dragged on, the feeling of unease intensified. The sound of footsteps echoed from the back room, though no one was there. The music started again, but this time it was a lullaby, soft and haunting. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, Amy, who worked the day shift. "Amy, I need you to come and get me now," I said, my voice trembling. "What happened? You okay?" she asked, concern in her voice. "I don't know. There's something wrong with this place," I said. "Just hurry. Please." A few minutes later, I saw the headlights of her car pulling into the parking lot. I ran outside as fast as I could, my heart still pounding in my chest. When I reached her car, she looked at me, wide-eyed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I have," I whispered. We didn't speak much on the drive home. I couldn't shake the feeling that the diner was still watching me, still waiting for me to return. And even now, months later, I sometimes hear that strange laughter in my dreams. I never went back to Luna's diner after that night. The memories still haunt me, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still lingering there, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to walk through the doors. The diner, with its greasy burgers and shiny chrome fixtures, was never quite the same to me again. It had become a place of shadows and whispers, a place where the past refused to stay buried. And every time I pass by, I can't help but wonder, what is still waiting inside? Story: The Message in the Shadows. It was my first solo night shift at the small, dimly lit gas station on the outskirts of town. I was 17, still fresh out of high school, and the sense of independence that came with working the graveyard shift made me feel like I was part of the adult world. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each minute dragging on as the night settled into its usual monotony. There were no customers yet, and the air outside was crisp with the chill of early autumn. I was cleaning the counter when the sound of the door chimes jingled, announcing a customer. I looked up, expecting the usual late-night travelers or the occasional local getting snacks before heading home. Instead, a man walked in, someone I had never seen before. He was strange, wearing a worn jacket over a t-shirt, but oddly enough, no shirt underneath. The cold night air outside should have made him shiver, but he seemed oblivious. His shorts, which were too short for the season, swayed as he walked. He was limping slightly, the sound of his uneven footsteps echoed through the store. His unshaven face was pale and gaunt, almost sickly looking. He had wild, unkempt hair that fell over his face, and his eyes were glazed over, like he wasn't really present. The man made his way to the counter, muttering something to himself that I couldn't quite catch. I gave him a polite smile and asked if I could help him. He paused for a moment, looked at me with a vacant expression, and then simply said, "Say hello to Pam for me." I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "Pam?" I asked, trying to make sense of his request. "Who's Pam?" The man didn't answer. He just nodded, as though I should already know who Pam was. I was taken aback by how casual he was, despite how strange the entire encounter felt. Without another word, he shuffled to the coffee station, grabbed a cup, filled it, and paid me for it. As he left, he turned back and muttered again, "Say hello to Pam." I watched him leave, the door jingling as he limped out into the cold night. His presence lingered in the store long after he was gone. It wasn't just his odd appearance, it was the sense that something wasn't quite right about the whole interaction. My stomach tightened with unease. I didn't think much of it at the time, but as the minutes ticked by, I found myself replaying the strange encounter in my mind. Who was Pam? Why had he asked me to pass on a message to her? And why did it feel like something was off, like I had just been a part of something I didn't fully understand? It wasn't long before another customer entered the store. A woman, probably in her early 40s, walked up to the counter, a regular who had been coming in for years. I greeted her with a smile, but she seemed distracted, lost in thought. I began ringing up her items when something made me pause. I suddenly remembered the man's strange request. "I ran into someone earlier," I said, trying to sound casual. "He mentioned you, told me to say hello." The woman stopped in her tracks. Her face went pale, and she froze for a moment. Her eyes widened in a mixture of confusion and fear. "What did he look like?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I described the man as best as I could. Shorts, jacket, limping. Her face went even whiter, and she suddenly looked like she had seen a ghost. Without another word, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and started dialing a number. Her hands were trembling. "Pam?" I asked, but she didn't answer me. Instead, she said to the person on the phone, "Lock the doors. Call the police. I'll be home in 3 minutes. Don't let anyone in." I was completely stunned. "Is everything okay?" I asked, but she didn't respond. She just hung up the phone, paid for her items in a rush, and bolted out the door, leaving me standing there in complete confusion. I glanced over at the door, which had already closed behind her. What had just happened? Who was that man, and why had Pam reacted so dramatically? The unease in my stomach deepened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. I told myself that I was just overthinking things. Maybe Pam had some history with the man that I didn't know about. Maybe it was a coincidence. But the look on her face, the panic in Her eyes made me doubt that explanation. There was something more to this, and I was too young and inexperienced to understand it. The rest of my shift felt like a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mind kept replaying the encounter over and over again. Who was the man? What had he meant by saying hello to Pam? And why did Pam react the way she did? As the clock ticked toward the end of my shift, I began to feel like I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner or glanced into the dimly lit aisles, I half expected to see the man standing there, watching me. But he never came back. The next morning, I woke up early to head home, exhausted and still shaken by the events of the previous night. I couldn't stop thinking about the man and Pam's strange behavior. As I got into my car and drove down the empty road toward home, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the rearview mirror, I saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the gas station parking lot, just outside the range of the headlights. It was too far away to make out any details, but I immediately recognized the silhouette. It was the man from last night. His lanky figure was unmistakable. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I sped up, weaving through the back roads to avoid being followed. My heart raced as I turned corner after corner, trying to lose him. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again, fearing what I might see. When I finally arrived home, I locked the door and felt a wave of relief wash over me. But that feeling didn't last long. I spent the rest of the day in a daze. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had somehow been following me. But I couldn't explain why or what he wanted. And what had Pam meant when she told her husband to lock the doors and call the cops? Days passed, and I tried to push the memory of the man and Pam's fearful reaction to the back of my mind. But I never saw Pam again, and the man's message haunted me. Was it a warning? A random encounter? Or was something else at play here, something I wasn't meant to understand? Months later, I heard rumors about Pam. They were whispers, things people said behind closed doors. She had moved away, they said, to get away from someone. But no one could ever explain who that someone was or why she had been so terrified. The strange man's message had never made sense, but now, after everything that had happened, I began to wonder if there was something more to the story than I could ever understand. The eerie feeling that had lingered from that night stayed with me for years, and I began to question everything I thought I knew about the world. Who was the man? And why did he want me to say hello to Pam? Story: The Silent Watcher. I used to work at an old, historic hotel in a small town nestled in the mountains. It wasn't the kind of hotel you'd find on the cover of a travel magazine. It had a certain charm: dark wood paneling, vintage chandeliers, and a grand staircase that creaked with every step. Most guests only stayed for a night or two, passing through on their way to the ski resorts or the hiking trails. But the staff? We were there for the long haul. I was one of the night shift managers, and it was my job to make sure the hotel ran smoothly once the sun went down. The hotel had been around for nearly a century. It had once been a lavish retreat for wealthy families, and it still had the remnants of its grand days: faded portraits on the walls, antique furniture, and a lobby that echoed with the whispers of its former guests. But over the years, the glamour had worn off. The hotel wasn't what it used to be, and most of the high-end clientele had moved on. What was left was an aging building and a few scattered, loyal customers who appreciated its quiet solitude. It was during my second week on the night shift that I first felt the weight of the hotel's history. My shift began at 10 p.m. The evening was quiet, the kind of night where the only sound you could hear was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the lobby and the occasional hum of the hotel's heating system. I had just finished checking the guest records when the front door opened with a soft chime. I looked up, expecting a late-night guest, but instead, it was just an elderly man, dressed in a worn-out overcoat, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He walked in slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the hardwood floors. There was something strange about the way he moved, deliberate, almost as if he were trying to avoid making too much noise. He didn't acknowledge me, but instead made his way to one of the armchairs by the fireplace and sat down. At first, I thought nothing of it. Some guests like to sit and enjoy the warmth of the fire before heading up to their rooms. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man never moved from his seat. He just sat there, staring into the flames, his face hidden beneath his hat. I was about to walk over to offer him a drink when I noticed something odd. The rest of the hotel was completely silent. No one else was in the lobby, and I hadn't heard the elevator ding or the distant sound of footsteps. It was as if the hotel had emptied out completely, leaving just the two of us in the vast, empty space. I approached the man cautiously, but as I got closer, I realized something that made my blood run cold. His cane wasn't tapping against the floor. It was floating just inches above the ground, hovering unnaturally. My heart began to race, and I felt an overwhelming urge to turn around and walk away. But before I could move, the man looked up at me. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to stare straight through me. "Don't mind me," he said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "I'm just waiting for the others." I froze. The others? There was no one else in the hotel. Everyone else had checked out hours ago. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else emerge from the shadows, but the lobby remained empty. I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I stood there, staring at the man as he returned his gaze to the fire. I tried to force myself to speak, but my throat had gone dry. I didn't want to provoke him, or whatever he was. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together and quickly made my way behind the front desk. My hands were shaking as I sat down, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? Why was he here? And why did I feel like I wasn't alone, even though the lobby was empty? The man stayed in the same spot for the rest of my shift. Every now and then, I would glance up from my paperwork, and I could see him sitting there, as still as a statue. The only sign of life was the faint, rhythmic tap of his cane, but it wasn't tapping the floor. It was tapping against the air, as if he was tapping into something that wasn't visible to the human eye. As midnight approached, I knew my shift was almost over. The clock ticked louder and louder in the stillness, each second making the tension in the room thicker. I decided to leave the man alone and finish my closing duties. I needed to check the halls, the back rooms, and the bathrooms before I could lock up for the night. But as I stood up and turned to walk down the hall, I heard something that made me freeze in place. A faint whisper. It came from the direction of the man's seat by the fire. I slowly turned, my heart hammering in my chest. The man hadn't moved, but the whisper was clearer now. It wasn't in English, though. It sounded like a language I couldn't recognize. Something old, like a chant or a prayer from another time. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and ran to the back office. I was about to call security when I noticed something strange on the security monitors. There, on the camera feed for the lobby, was the man, or at least, I thought it was him. But his image on the screen was different. The man I saw in the lobby was wearing a tattered overcoat, but the man on the screen was dressed in a military uniform, a uniform from a bygone era. I blinked, and when I looked again, the image was gone. The feed was static. But the image had been so clear, so vivid, that I couldn't shake it from my mind. I picked up the phone, but before I could dial, I heard footsteps echoing down the hall. I didn't need to check the monitor to know who it was. The man was walking toward me, his cane tapping against the floor, even though the floors were empty. I didn't wait for him to reach me. I grabbed my things, ran out the side door, and didn't stop until I was outside. My ride arrived just as the clock struck 2 a.m., and I left the hotel in a rush, unable to explain what had happened. The next morning, I returned to the hotel with a colleague to take over my shift. I didn't tell him what I had seen the night before. But when I passed by the lobby, I noticed something strange. The seat where the man had sat was empty, but there was a fresh cup of coffee on the table in front of it. It wasn't there when I left, but it was there now. The same brand, the same steaming warmth. I didn't stick around to ask questions. I knew what I had seen. And I knew the man, or whatever he was, wasn't done with the hotel just yet. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.